Most Britons blame the Chinese government for allowing COVID-19 to become a worldwide pandemic, a new survey shows. It follows revelations of systematic cover-ups by Beijing in the crucial first weeks of the outbreak in December, and a concerted disinformation campaign since February. A UK poll conducted by Redfield and Wilton Strategies as part of their research into global health and governance opinion found that 55% of Britons agreed that the Chinese government to blame for the spread of the coronavirus pandemic. Only 26% disagreed, while 19% of the 2,000 canvassed said they did not know. Crucially, of those who blame China, a resounding 69% voted Conservative in December's general election. The findings will add further pressure for Boris Johnson to reverse his decision to allow state-funded Chinese telecoms giant Huawei to take part in the roll-out of 5G across the country. China has been criticized for not informing the World Health Organization of the virus' potential human transmission until January 23, when Beijing began to lock down Wuhan. During the first 3 weeks of January, more than 5 million people were allowed to leave the province to potentially spread the contagion further. A systematic disinformation campaign using state-supporting media outlets later claimed that both the US and Italy were responsible for the original outbreaks. Earlier this week, however, a report from NTD News, which is critical of the regime, confirmed that 19 countries around the world, including the US and Italy, could pinpoint their patient zeros to people who had traveled from Wuhan or had been close contacts. Italy, which had suffered the highest death toll 19,468 until it was overtaken by the US yesterday, has pinpointed its patient zeros to a Chinese couple from Wuhan. For the U.S., which now has the highest number of COVID-19 deaths at 20,007 and more than 500,000 cases, it was a man who traveled back from Wuhan and tested positive on January 20. Others include France, Belgium, Germany, Sweden, Finland, Canada, UAE, India, Thailand, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Vietnam, Nepal, Australia, Cambodia, Philippines, and Singapore. Earlier this week there were further reports of more outbreaks in Wuhan, despite 65,000 people leaving the province after lockdown was ended on Wednesday. Last night China expert Matthew Henderson, who served with the FCO in Beijing and is now head of the Henry Jackson Society's Asia program, said, "This is an extremely significant poll, particularly in what it tells us about how conservatives feel about the conservative government's current approach to China. We can make an informed assumption that fewer conservatives held Sino-skeptic views before the COVID-19 outbreak. This has changed and that change is well-founded. Beijing has systemically lied about its coronavirus problem and, if recent reports are accurate, continues to willfully ignore c.o.r.o.n.a international health regulations guidelines to this day. We can now infer that constituent Tories may have changed their thoughts about. China has lost the trust of the world in its capacity to manage an appalling event, which it should have known how to deal with from its precious experience with SARS. Beijing clearly has utter contempt for the c.o.r.o.n.a, the world's only international instrument to deal with pandemics. Britain has become dangerously dependent on Chinese trade, investment and funding over the last 2 decades. We now find ourselves vulnerable to real harm in all of these areas. MPs last night predicted that the government would be defeated over Huawei when Parliament resumes. COVID-19 is a foreign policy game-changer, like 9/11 but more so, said influential Tory MP Mark Francois. When the now stalled integrated review eventually restarts, the single most challenging question facing Whitehall is going to be, I suspect the government will now very likely drop Huawei anyway. If they were still mad enough to plow on with Huawei, I don't just think they would lose, they'd be slaughtered. Tom Tugendhat, who chairs the Parliamentary Foreign Affairs Select Committee, added, the awareness of the true cost of communist tyranny is growing. The lies and fear needed to keep the Chinese people prisoners of the regime is undermining our own freedoms and the fight against coronavirus. We need to wake up to the threats we face and act.